Chapter 5. The news that Briar and Rosethorn had been joined by delicate Hannah was greeted with relief at Discipline Cottage. Everyone went to bed early that night, tired by worry and their own labors. Tris woke some time after midnight to the sound of rain tapping the thatch overhead. She put on her spectacles, a wool gown, and a shawl, sending her power out. The familiar sense of hot metal in the room across from hers was missing. She frowned, then remembered that Daja was at Frostpines, working and sleeping at his forge. With a sigh, Tris let her magic seep through the boards and the plaster between her and the ground floor. Lark slept heavily, the warmth of her magic lower than Tris had ever felt it. Sandry was in the same shape. They had worked hard, putting their strength into the masks and gloves for Crane and his staff. Tris found Little Bear's life force, that of a dozing animal with unhappy dreams. He had to be sleeping. He had to be sleeping in Briar's room again. Her sense of him was nearly overpowered by the magic that radiated from Briar's shakan. Over its 146-year existence, the miniature tree had been used to store and build upon the magic of its earlier owners. Its green strength pressed on her own power. There was a curiously similar feel to the shakan and to Little Bear, a kind of sadness. They missed Briar. We all do, she muttered crossly, stuffing her feet into thin leather slippers. Can't you keep it to yourself? With the stealth of months of practice, she had left the house, though she wondered why she bothered to be quiet. From the feel of Sandry and Lark, Tris thought she might bang kettle lids in their ears, and they wouldn't twitch. Through the back gate she passed, then between the fence and the vineyard. Over the winter she had worn a path in the grass, one that led across a band of open ground. It went straight to the closest stairs on the inside of Winding Circle's thick wall. Rain fell as steadily as she climbed, hoisting her skirts to keep from tripping, panting with effort. At least these days no one who saw her puffing was silly enough to yell at her to lose weight. Before she had learned to control her power, and the way it produced hail or lightning whenever she was vexed. Someone had teased her with interesting results. Learning to control her magic had meant she had to give up rewarding those people who gave cruel advice. She hadn't liked that, even when Nico pointed out that those she frightened became enemies. Nico is a spoil sport, thought Tris, trying to catch her breath as she stepped onto the top of the wall. Most nights when she came up here, she walked south to get a view of the harbor islands and the pebbled sea beyond. There was no glimpse of the sea tonight. The rain cloaked it. Below and to her right lay the joining of the roads that wrapped around Winding Circle and the granite ridge between the temple and the mire. The slum and, and even-walled summer sea were gone from view. No light cut through the rain, not even that of the harbor beacons. One day, a quiet voice began. Tris gasped and jumped. Nico's approach had taken her by surprise. He steadied the girl with a hand on her shoulder. She could barely see his craggy face under the wide-brimmed hat he'd worn to keep off the wet. I didn't mean to frighten you, he said. Well, you did, muttered Tris. What were you going to say? Only that, if you ever get a home of your own, you ought to consider a nice tower, preferably on a cliff. You seem to prefer lookout spots. I'm a weather mage, aren't I? She asked. Of course I like heights. Tell me, weather mage, how long do you expect this storm to last? Tris sent her power rolling into the clouds. A day, maybe two, she replied, testing the feel of water, heat, and cold in the air. Hard rain toward dawn, misty-like until 10 in the morning, light rain after. Can you make it end? Usher the storm away from here? Tris stared at him. You just asked me to meddle with the weather. Yes, he evaded her eyes, staring out in the dark landscape. But you threatened dire things if I use my power like that. I'm not allowed to muck with nature. Side note. In the very first book, Tris tried to stop the tide, and control the weather that way, and she almost died. So, Playing with the weather is no joke. So, this is a big deal. This is different, Nico said. How do you know you're telling me to do it won't turn out as badly as if I did it on my own? She demanded. I don't, was the flat reply. I feel it's important enough to try, though, or I never would have brought it up. That made her nervous. Please explain, she said, unusually meek. Nico sighed. It seems this disease isn't carried in the air, which is the only good news we've had all week. That leaves human contact, insects or animals, or water. If animals were carriers, we would have noticed sick ones. There are no flies or mosquitoes at this time of year, though we can't rule out fleas and lice. I believe this thing spreads too quickly to be simply a matter of human contact, though Crane won't rule that out. The only thing we can try to change is water, said Triss. The water in the sewers rises by the hour, said Nico. It may already be leaking into the city's wells. It certainly will do so if the water continues to rise. If we can move this rain along, our outlook will be improved. Triss removed her shoes, spectacles, and shawl, handing them to Nico. She climbed into one of the flat-bottomed notches in the top of the wall and turned away from the wind. The storm was at her back, coming from the southeast, bound for the northern mountains. She spread herself in it and let its motion thrust her into its leading edge. The hills around Summersea rolled under her. Rivers, streams, towns, she felt them all as she flowed overhead, bound for the great mountains beyond. An opposing wind in her face brought her to a halt. Here was a pressure to counter the storm she rode. A whirling mass of air entrenched nearly 30 miles to the north. It would go nowhere if she insisted, and if she insisted, she would regret it. She had met such things before and wouldn't have cared if she had had no storm at her back to move along. She jumped onto the edge of the unmoving northern system. Following its edge west as she sought a gap where she could put her storm, she found none. At last she gave up. Returning to the storm over Winding Circle, she used its power to send her shooting high above the clouds into open air. Safe from her storm's pull, she turned west again, still looking for a space to move it to. There was nothing she would not have to fight other weather to clear. Cat dirt, thought Triss, using a favorite expression of Sandry's. Curious, she sank until she was caught up in her storm's counterclockwise spin. She let it drag her south and east, saving her own strength for the return trip. At the storm's southernmost point, she yanked free. A fresh storm caught her almost instantly. She let it pull her even further south and jumped free, straight into a third storm. When at last she opened her body's eyes, she found that the sky showed barely pink through the small break in the eastern clouds. A fine drizzle fell on Winding Circle. Her body had gone stiff in her absence. She lurched and saw that there was but an inch between her feet and the edge of the wall. She'd forgotten she'd stood in a notch, with nothing to keep her from walking into thin air. A wiry arm circled her waist and yanked her back. Triss and Nico both tumbled into the walkway in an undignified pile. When she rolled off of him, Nico sat up, gasping for air. Don't ever do that by yourself, he scolded when he caught his breath. You might have been killed. I noticed, replied Triss, shuddering. Nico fumbled at his belt, producing a flask. He opened it and put it to her lips. Triss drank obediently, trying not to let the sweet tea leak between her chattering teeth. It was a mixture she didn't recognize, flavored with dates, citron, and plums. That isn't one of Rose Thorn's, she gasped when she was done. She didn't need to see the magic that infused the tea, she felt it in her veins. Her head cleared, and her chilled body warmed quickly. Excuse me. Moonstream fixed it, replied Nico, returning the flask to his belt. I assume you were gone so long for a reason? Have you good news for me? Triss lurched to her feet, wringing her very wet skirts. Nico remained on the walkway, staring up at her, eyes bright under his broad-brimmed hat. Taking a deep breath, Triss said, I can move this storm, but it won't mean anything. There are storms behind it for hundreds of miles. They're dumping rain over the whole east half of the pebbled sea. Whatever I send off will be replaced in a day, even less." Nico's heavy brows snapped together in a frown. "Why now, O gods?" he demanded. "Why give us all this rain now? We don't need—" "Hoy!" someone yelled from down below, in side-winding circle. "I was told Niclar and Goldeye is up there?" "How could anybody know that?" asked Triss as Nico got up. "While you were busy," he said dryly, "I had several chats with the guards. They must have told him." He leaned over the edge of the walkway. "One moment," he called, walking briskly to the staircase. Triss behind him, he descended. Their summoner looked happy to wait. He was bracing himself on spread knees as he fought to catch his breath. Triss was interested to see that he wore the uniform not of the Duke's Guard, which looked after the mire and everything else outside of Summersea's wall, but of the Provost's Guard, which patrolled inside it. "They said you was to know right off," the man wheezed when they reached him. "Someone told our captain. She ordered us to search the house. We found 3 of 'em. And then she ordered us do the flankin' houses, and we got 3 more in one and 5 in t'other. Captain's turning out all Cobbler's Lane. Now, you're wanted in town." Nico held up a hand, his expression bleak. 3, 3, and 5 what?" he asked, his voice slightly husky. The guard took a deep breath and straightened. "It's the blue pox, Master Goldeye," he said, his eyes haunted. "Inside the city wall." Short chapter today, but we'll start chapter 6 in the next video. See you then.